you better identify it, deal with it, and if you're someone who is along that narcissistic spectrum, you can work to change it. Yep, narcissistic personality disorder is treatable. Easily? No, but possible. But we're not done. We got more. Now, other factors that impair the individual's ability to recognize their narcissism are defense mechanisms. Ever wonder why some people with narcissistic personality disorder can't seem to see their own behavior? Well, in this video, we're going to really find out what's going on in their minds and what prevents them from actually having insight into their behavior. So let's check it out. Here we go. All right. So narcissists often don't realize they're narcissists, and this is because they lack self-awareness. And that's certainly a universal criteria across all personality disorders. Now, this is partly due to impaired insight, where they don't see their flaws that others tend to notice. And they use many different strategies to avoid facing their own shortcomings, which often leads them to blaming others instead of taking that responsibility. Now, this lack of reflection often is reinforced by cultural or personal habits, and it keeps them from truly understanding themselves. Well, we're going to unpack it all, so we're going to dive on in. So first, let's talk about impaired insight. And when we talk about impaired insight, when we look at narcissistic personality disorder, we're talking about somebody with food on their chin. And you might be like, what? What are you talking about? Well, you ever have food like on your chin and you don't feel it, you don't recognize it, but everybody else at the table is kind of like, oh, Dan's got himself a little cream cheese right there. And it'd be either plain cream cheese or jalapeno cream cheese, because that's the kind of cream cheese I like. But so it's there, but I don't feel it, but everybody else notices it. And that's really similar. But I think the way a lot of people conceptualize narcissists and narcissism is that it's more like having a giant fish, like a giant salmon, over your entire face. And everybody sees it, and you would see that giant salmon. But that isn't the case. That's not what it's like. It's that impaired insight. They don't recognize that their thinking patterns, that their belief, behaviors, and patterns actually are to keep their sense of self, their core content, safe. And classic core content, which I talk about in my other videos as well, for narcissistic individuals is fear, shame, doubt, guilt, and inferiority. And protecting that bubble, and they're not always the same in everybody. Somebody may have all five, somebody may have two of the fives. And people also have very individualized core content as well. So we don't want to say everybody who has narcissistic personality disorder has these 5 core content areas. That isn't true. But if they are there, or they're there in varying degrees, what we see is that they're, of course, some are stronger than others, but they have a protective layer. And that's part of the defense mechanisms. We're going to talk about that in just a sec. But it leads to impaired insight. So I talk about core content. I also talk about surface content. So surface content is impaired insight, as you don't see how these beliefs and behaviors that feed into patterns are disruptive to your relationships, how it hurts other people, how it drives often neglect, emotional, psychological, even sometimes physical abuse of children or spouses or others. So they lack that. They're missing it. They don't see what's on their chin. So it's important to recognize that diving in. Now, another component is how that individual along the narcissistic spectrum, and the reason why I say that is because the individual along the narcissistic spectrum, because everybody's at a different degree of narcissism. Absent, which of course means they don't have any narcissistic traits, behaviors, symptoms. But that's not what we're talking about here. Could be mild, moderate, severe, or extreme. So that's the whole spectrum. So we're going to talk about these individuals, and they're along that spectrum. Now, while the individual was growing up, they utilized this adaptive strategy of saying, well, there's nothing wrong with me, everything's wrong with them. And it could have been an emotionally abusive environment, could have been a neglectful environment, could have been sort of an over caretaking environment as well. But what happens in that over caretaking environment is that the individual tends to miss a lot of developmental experiences, a lot of those experiences that they need to build that self-confidence. But because they're so over cared for, they don't have those. So then the world becomes super scary. And that super scary leads to that development of core content so you can continue to function. And as the individual ideally gets older, right? So they start this adaptive strategy, and everybody has that. Everybody, in our teen years, it's why they say, teens are so difficult to work with, or to live with or whatever. We all went through the same thing, right? Egocentrism, which is excessive focus on the self, is really common as a teenager. But ideally, we shed it as we get older. Like a snake sheds its skin as it gets bigger, as it gets older. However, in the case of adults with narcissistic personality disorder, they didn't. For whatever reason, whatever occurred. There could be a whole host of reasons. Leave comments about why you think some individuals with narcissistic personality disorder, why don't they shed it? And that would be really interesting to hear from you. So please leave some comments in there. That'd be great. But they don't do that. So then they're hanging on to this very immature, and by immature, I mean early developmental period, management behavior, but they don't shed it. So it doesn't go away. So they don't end up learning how to really manage themselves, how to understand themselves. And we know that if someone has trouble kind of managing their emotions, it makes it hard for them to really understand what they're feeling. Because a lot of times emotions can be like this giant tidal wave, right? You're just standing on the beach and this giant tidal wave just drowns you, right? You ever do that? Or you turn your back to the ocean. You ever do that one? And you're kind of talking to your friends, your buddies, whatever, and a big wave hits you and you're like, whoa, right? And it's kind of that same thing because we lose track of that because in that moment, we're unable or we're having a degree of impairment into focusing on our emotions at that time. And what happens after that moment, we don't go back and look at it. Ideally, you would learn that probably not great to turn your back to the ocean, right? Particularly if you're not a good swimmer, particularly, whatever the waves might be, whatever those various factors may be. But if you don't learn from it, you continue to do that. And that's what we see. It's a reluctance to learn because of that impaired insight and that lack of awareness. And please understand that I'm not excusing narcissistic behaviors or whatever. We're just explaining the pathology so you have a better understanding, because if you understand it, you better identify it, deal with it, and if you're someone who is along that narcissistic spectrum, you can work to change it. Yep, narcissistic personality disorder is treatable. Easily? No, but possible. But we're not done. We got more. Now, other factors that impair the individual's ability to recognize their narcissism are defense mechanisms. Now, the two primary defense mechanisms are denial and projection. These are really, really common, but they do block self-awareness. And individuals who are utilizing denial and projection, that they tend to deny their flaws or project their own negative traits onto others. And this prevents them from recognizing their own shortcomings. It narrows their view, so they can't see it. So check out this example. And poor John is going to be the recipient of the narcissist having the inability in order to see the impact of their behavior. I didn't miss any deadline because there wasn't one in the first place. If anything went wrong, it's because John messed it up. He's always making mistakes, and now he's trying to make me look bad to cover up his own problems. Now, in this example, the individual with narcissistic personality disorder is refusing to admit that they did anything wrong. That's denial. And they're blaming someone else for the mistake. That's projection. This way, they don't have to feel bad. So remember, it's that protective layer. So they don't feel bad about themselves, and they can keep thinking they're better than others because I've done nothing wrong and I never do anything wrong. I am always squeaky clean and perfectly shiny. That's how they function. But it's not just defense mechanisms, because there are cognitive biases at play as well. Now, a common one is a self-serving bias. Right? So in a self-serving bias, right, this is when the individual gives themselves credit when things go well, but they blame others or other people or other circumstances when things go wrong. And this can make them see themselves in a way that is completely untrue. It's very distorted, so it's a self-serving bias, meaning that if something goes well, it's me. Something goes wrong, it's you. And if you're in a relationship with someone who is along the narcissistic spectrum, that self-serving bias likely comes out pretty often. But it doesn't stand alone. It's not just the self-serving bias. It is also kept in place by another bias that's called a confirmation bias. Now, a confirmation bias is when that same individual only pays attention to information that supports what they already believe and ignores anything that disagrees with those beliefs. Now, this can stop them from seeing the full picture, especially about themselves. And one of the big problems with social media is that social media curates to reinforce your confirmation bias, which gives you a false sense of safety. And that's true for narcissists as well. Is it because they've curated everything in their life with that confirmation bias, that self-serving bias, they don't feel challenged in any way because they're so shrouded by those cognitive biases, which in fact falls under that narcissism. Let me give you an example. Jim believes he's always the thoughtful one in his relationship with Jessie. Now, after planning a successful date, he thinks, I'm so good at making things special. You know, a little congratulatory, right? Self-congratulations there. But when another date goes poorly, he blames Jessie, saying, you didn't seem interested in anything I planned. And then later, when reflecting on the evening, Jim only remembers the time Jessie seemed uninterested, ignoring the moments when Jessie engaged and showed appreciation. This is an illustration of that self-serving bias and confirmation bias at work. And you see that it reinforces itself. Narcissism actually falls into a self-sustaining feedback loop. So because I'm narcissistic and I hold these biases and these defense mechanisms along with that lack of insight, so I exhibit or utilize narcissistic belief, behaviors, and patterns, so then I don't see my behavior. I don't see the impact because it's distorted. It is a distortion. Now, it's not to the distorted level of like psychosis or delusional, but it's pretty severe. And the greater the severity of the narcissism, the greater the individual is wedded to those unhealthy defense mechanisms and those cognitive biases. Now, the other component that we have to talk about is one that is more about the individual's social circle in which they function. And within the social circle that the individual, narcissistic individual, functions, this is called capitulation. Now, you may have capitulated in the past, and you may capitulate today, and you may capitulate later on. So basically, capitulation means you give in, right? You hold this idea that it's just easier to agree than to try to correct him or her. So this is that people in the narcissist's circle don't take time to think about their own feelings and actions or get feedback from others. So they might not really understand themselves well. And in the developmental period, in the teens, right, we're supposed to shed that. That's when we're supposed to experience that. We're supposed to experience feedback, not criticism. Criticism entails shaming, belittling, right, guilt, all of those things, making someone feel small, hoping that they'll change. See, that doesn't work on human beings. You're never going to make someone feel bad enough to do good things, whether they're a teenager or an adult. So don't do that. But in those teenage years, they didn't receive that. They didn't receive that feedback. So instead, the narcissism stayed in place, and it exacerbated as the person aged, got older, and continuing to utilize these strategies. Now, does that mean that it's everybody else's fault if we're going to talk about fault? And first of all, let me tell you, my perspective on blame and shame is it's a waste of time. It's a waste of time to do it to yourself because it keeps you fixated in a very negative and unhealthy comfort zone. And blaming others, that doesn't do anything either, because it takes away any kind of efficacy that you need to change, right? But when we're talking about capitulation, we're talking about narcissism, is that nobody really illustrates, points out that what they're doing is hurting others, that what they're doing is actually preventing them from moving forward, preventing them from connecting to people, preventing them from having honest, open relationships. See, people don't do that. So because they give in or they give up, they're like, it's just easier to agree. Let him go about his way. Somebody else somewhere will deal with him or her. It's a bad move. Now, if they come into treatment, like with me, for example, there isn't going to be any capitulation, but I'm not going to beat them down, right? That doesn't help, right? So instead, what I do is I align with them so that they learn to trust me and feel safe in working with me. Because then when they do that, we can then work through surface behaviors, right? All those destructive beliefs, behaviors, and patterns that are causing all the problems in their relationships. Then we're going to look at those defense mechanisms, how they're not helpful. Try to push those to the side. Those really unhealthy, unhelpful defense mechanisms, we're going to try to attenuate those. We're going to turn them down. And what we're going to do is find adaptive strategies and turn those up so they can achieve the things that they want. But we have to then get to core content and find out and identify what the core content areas are. Then we have to help that individual minimize, control, have good insight of that core content so that then they're turning it down and they can feel more empowered, have greater strength. And we're also going to look for positive core content areas as well to accentuate those. Sound easy? It's not, and it takes a long time, and it is a very slow process, but it is a possible process. Absolutely, absolutely. So I hope you found this helpful. Check out this video. It's navigating narcissistic entitlement and mastering boundaries. That's really important, so check that out. And leave a comment, give a like, and I'll see you next time. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.